you can introduce yourself to the community. Does that sound good to you?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have a full house today.
Yay, nice.
¿Están listos? Okay.
Chicos de Ayamano, los invito a tomar asiento, por favor. Bueno, ahora tenemos nuestra siguiente charla, que está a cargo de nuestra Google Developer Expert, Loiane. Ella nos está hablando desde Brasil y, bueno, ella actualmente está trabajando en una empresa que se llama Citibank como asesora de negocios y desarrolladora de software. Ella lleva más de 10 años en este campo, así que demos una cordial bienvenida a Loiane.
Gracias. Okay. Hi, my name is Loiane. I'm a software developer at Citibank. I'm also a Google Developer Expert and Microsoft MVP. And I hope to give you a few tips today during the presentation, and I hope you like it. Well, my Spanish is not very good. I can talk a little bit of Portuñol, so I'll be presenting the talk in English, if that's okay.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Hey. Yay! Let me share my screen. Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Yes!
Yay! Okay, perfect. Okay, so the idea for this talk is to try to answer a few questions that I get a lot from the members of the community. We have a lot of Angular tutorials on the internet. We have a lot of tips as well, but sometimes we still have some questions when we start working in a real project. Questions such as, how do you organize your project? Do you create everything in the app module? Do you create smaller modules? Or if we are working in a team, let's say we have 5 developers working in an Angular project, we don't want to look like 5 people are working this project. We want to look like only one person is working. So we want to keep consistency and a standard in the code. So with this session, with this talk, I hope to answer a few of these questions for you. As I mentioned, my name is Loiane. I have some of my social networks as well. You can ping me on Twitter. Twitter is where you can find me the most. But here are also some other links where you can find me. And let's get to it. So the first tip is the Angular CLI. It might seem a common sense to use CLI, especially nowadays, but there are still a lot of developers that are not using the CLI, especially developers that started to work with Angular right in the beginning when Angular was in the release candidate in the beta versions. So these developers are still using System.js. But if you are starting a project today, or if you have the opportunity, it is always a good idea to upgrade and use the Angular CLI. So with the CLI, we have a tool that is going to generate all the Bootstrap code for us. All the code is structured, and we don't have to do anything. All we're going to have to do is focus on developing the components for our application. So it's a great deal, and it's going to save us some time. And with the CLI, there are a lot of functionalities available, not only creating the project. So if you need to create a new component, for instance, you don't need to new file and provide the extension of the file, copy paste from maybe some other component. The CLI already generates the components for us. It can also serve the project locally. We can also create services, classes. There are a lot of schematics available. And the latest addition to CLI is the ng update. So this is a great tool, especially because whenever you can, it's always a good idea to keep your project up to date with the latest version. So if you have a project, let's say with Angular 5, and you need to upgrade it to Angular 6, there are still a few steps, and sometimes maybe it's not a nice, it's a lot of effort that you have to put into it. But with the ng update, you just run one command and Angular will do whatever it can to help us smooth the transition between one version and the other. And same things applies to the latest version, which is version 6. If you have a project in version 6.0, you can still upgrade to version 6.1 just using the ng update. So it's going to update your package.json, and that's it. All the work is done. And of course, if you're not a big fan of the command line of the terminal, you prefer to use a software for that, there is also this awesome tool that is called the Angular console. It provides a user-friendly interface to help us create and also serve the project and create the components, the services, and also other schematics. So if you never heard of it, try it out because it's really nice. It only has for Windows and Mac, but I'm sure soon they will provide for other platforms as well. So once we create our project with the Angular CLI, we need to decide where we're going to open it. It's also a very important step to decide what's going to be the IDE or the editor we're going to use. There are great IDEs on the market. One of them is WebStorm. I love WebStorm, but my favorite is Visual Studio Code. VSCode is open source, it is free, and you can use it in whatever operating system you are using. It can be Mac, Windows, or Linux. VSCode has built-in support for TypeScript, which is used by Angular, so we get all the IntelliSense, which is great. But we can also leverage some other functionalities as well. So some of these functionalities, let's take a look at them. So the first one is, as I mentioned in the introduction, consistency is something that is very important in a project. Even if 5 developers are working on a project, we do not want to look like 5 different developers are changing the code. What we want to look like, it's only one developer has worked on the project and is changing the code. So we need to keep a consistency. That is one of the reasons that companies usually create code conventions. But of course, even with the code convention, sometimes we have our own thing. So sometimes we have our own way to code in the project. So that's one functionality that is really nice on VSCode, is that VSCode supports the workspace settings. We can create our own custom settings for us, but inside the project, we can also have these custom settings for the team. And whatever you have inside the project, it's going to override your local settings as well. The first one that I usually recommend having, especially in Angular projects, are the extensions. So inside this inside this .vscode folder, you can create these files. So the first one is the extensions.json. You can list all the cool extensions that you think that makes you more productive. And there are a lot of extensions available for Angular. Right here, I listed 2 extensions that extension packs that I created, but you can list any that you think that it's that will be helpful for the project. And this way, whenever a developer opens VS Code for the first time with the project, VS Code is going to display kind of a pop-up saying, would you like to install these extensions? These are the recommended ones. So this helps to everyone to have the same extensions, and then you will get the same functionality available as well. So I have created this extension pack for me and my team. This is what I use in my daily basis. I also use it for my Angular course in Portuguese, but there are other great extensions as well. John Papa has some really cool extensions and a very popular extension pack. So if you never heard of it, go to the VS Code marketplace and check it out. Just search for Angular. You will see a lot of great extensions there. The second file, and this is one, for me, it's my favorite, which is the settings.json. This is especially because we can overwrite the local user settings with settings that we can use for the project. And one example, I'm going to give you one example where this is really helpful, is tabs or spaces. I'm sure some of you will prefer tabs and some of you will prefer spaces. So we don't have to get into a fight to decide which one's better. With a setting like this, with this configuration, we can configure something for the project. The Angular TS-lint, which is the linting file that comes whenever you create a project with the Angular CLI, recommends using 2 spaces. So that's the default of Angular. Even if you use tabs or if you use 4 spaces and you run the ng-lint in the project, it's going to tell you 2 spaces are recommended. So one of the extensions that are available, which is called the prettier, you can configure what do you want to do, if you want to use tabs or if you want spaces. In this case, I have configured to use spaces, and it's 2. So particularly, I prefer to use tabs, so I can continue using tabs in an Angular project, and this extension will transform my tab into 2 spaces, so there is no need to fight about it. And you can also add other configurations as well, and everyone in the team can use the same configuration, which is the most nice thing for me working with a team with Angular. The third tip for VS Code and Angular is the launch.json. So this is great for debugging. For Angular, I see 3 ways of debugging Angular. So first one is using the Augury extension that is available for Google Chrome. But where I work, I'm not allowed to install any extensions on Chrome. So that is blocked for us. So the only way that I have to debug JavaScript projects, and particularly Angular projects, is using console.log. But that's a lot of work. Sometimes you want to have a more deep experience. You need something more to debug your projects and maybe find that bug and fix it. So you can link the code in VSCode, meaning the TypeScript code that you are writing in VSCode, with the Angular code, which is pure JavaScript that is running on the browser. So when you create this file, launch.json, and you can do that in VS Code as well, it creates automatically this for you. You just have to open, just do the Ctrl-Shift-P, and then you do the launch, and it's going to create this file automatically for you. And then all you have to do is just set the localhost port 4200, and you're set. So once you click on the debug icon on VS Code, it's going to link to the one that is being running on your browser, and then you'll be able to debug and hatch a much richer experience. Another thing that we can also do VS Code, and this is I also like to use in my daily basis, is the tasks that are available. So I mostly use ng-serve, ng-test, and ng-build. So these are the 3 commands I use the most in my daily basis. So if you don't want to, you don't need to open a terminal just to execute this command. You can create tasks in VS Code and define shortcuts so you can automatically run these tasks through a shortcut. So here we can define the npm build, and it's going to run the build script that you have in your package.json. And you can also run the npm test. If you want to, you can also run the npm start, which is going to serve the project. And as I mentioned, you don't have to open a terminal to do the npm run start. You can define a keybindings.json in VS Code. And then, for example, you can define that Ctrl-Shift-S is going to be the shortcut that is going to run the ng-serve for you. So whatever you want to, Ctrl-Shift-S, and then you have the ng-serve running without opening a terminal. So this can save a lot of time as well. Okay, so let's go to the third tip. When working with Angular, by default, we have two environments, the production and the development. But we can add more environments as well. And it all depends on the workflow that you use on a daily basis. So how do you develop Angular applications? If you are a full stack developer, maybe you are using Angular with a .NET or maybe Java or maybe Node.js. So if you are working on a project and doing the front end and the back end, and you are a full stack developer, do you start from the front end? Do you do the back end first? So how do you work? Or if you're working on a team and you are working on the Angular, do you wait for the backend team to complete the code on the backend first, or do you do it in parallel? So how does it work? So environments can be useful in these situations as well. So you can configure multiple environments if needed. So one setting that I like to have in my Angular projects is that I usually have two development environments. One I'm going to use to develop the screen and work on the layout, just to make sure, let's say I'm developing a form. I just want to make sure that the fields are in the right place. If I resize the screen, I have a responsive design. So all of these things that have nothing to do with the backend code. So at this point, I don't need the backend code yet. So for this, I usually create a local development file. And right here, I can use the npm dev script, and I can do an ng-serve, use the configuration development. And whenever I'm ready to run my code with the backend, after I am done creating the screen, I can use the development with the backend, which is usually the environment.ts, which is the default environment. So with this, I can just run ng-serve, and then I have my proxy just to integrate with the backend. And when you don't pass the configuration, Angular is going to use the environment.ts by default. And once you're done, you can use the ng-build prod, which is going to use the production environment. So you can create as many files as you need, and you can add as many variables as you need in these files. So if you have also a QA or integration environment, you can also create a new file, a fourth or fifth file, just for this new environment. And to configure, before Angular version 6, it was a little bit different. Now with Angular version 6, we need to go to angular.json and add a new environment. So you give the name that you want. So make sure that environment.dev, this is going to be the same name here. And then you say that you want to replace the environment.ts with the name of your file. So it's very simple as that. And you can have as many configurations as needed. And to use it, it's very simple. So here we can just make a reference to the environment and the variable, and there you go. Angular is going to use the correct value depending on the environment that you are. So this is really good because when developing, you don't need to have a hard-coded value here. And then when you go to production, you just do a lot of search and replace in your project. This way, you only need to change a single file or a parameter. This is another tip that I also like to recommend in case you are working locally, just prototyping. So if you don't have a backend yet, but you still want to emulate the backend, a database, you can use this package, which is called the JSON server. And then you can do all the RESTful operations for the CRUD, the create, read, update, and delete. So this is really useful when you create a prototype. And all you have to do is create just a database.json. So you can give any name you want. And then you just do the JSON server, watch, and then name your JSON file. And there you go. You have a node server, and you can do create author. You can remove an author. It's also going to update your JSON file as well. So this can be really helpful when you are in the first stages. And if you do have the backend already, and when working with the backend, sometimes we know it's not always like the tutorials we see on the internet. We have a very big JSON, and we have a nested object inside another object, and it's just a mess. And if we are creating an Angular screen that's going to consume that JSON, it might be a little time consuming to create an interface or a class in TypeScript that is going to represent that JSON. So if you have a very big JSON, you can use this VS Code extension as well, and then you can just copy, and you have the classes created for you. So this is really useful, especially if you have those big JSONs with nested objects. It also helps you to save a lot of time. Okay, so now we know to use CLI. We know we need to choose an IDE. We know we can create different environments. And let's get started and do some coding as well. So whenever you start working with Angular, it's always good to keep in mind the Angular style guide, which is available in the official documentation. So you can access this anytime. The style guide has great tips to improve your Angular code, and a lot of lists and the do's and don'ts. So if you still have questions, should I do this? Should I not do this? Maybe you can open the style guide and see what the style guide is recommending. So this is great, and also helps it also helps you to write some clean code, and it's going to be easier to maintain and for other developers to read as well. And the Angular team is always keeping up to date with the latest versions of Angular. So this is also really nice. So speaking of the Angular style guide, there is one functionality in VS Code that I think that helps me with the style guide, in particular related to the organizing imports. So import, sometimes you declare a variable. VS Code has the automatic import that you can use, but sometimes you delete the variable, the component. You would no longer need the component in your component or in your template, and then you have just an import. And that's going to be added to your bundle. And you don't want any unnecessary code to be added to your production bundle. You only want whatever Angular needs to run in your production bundle. So you want to keep it clean. So on May, VS Code added the organize imports functionality that is going to organize the imports alphabetically, and also is going to remove the unused imports. So before May, there was this extension that is called the TypeScript Hero. This is one of my favorite extensions that although VS Code organizes the import, it doesn't organize exactly as the style guide tells us to do. So the style guide tells us to import Angular, the Angular core or HTTP or forms first. Then we can have RxJS, and then we can have the third-party libraries such as Angular Material, ng Bootstrap, ng Prime, whatever third-party library you use. And we skip a line, and then we add our own imports. So the VS Code auto import and organize import is not going to do that. It's only going to organize. It doesn't skip the line. So what I like about this extension is that it organizes the imports exactly as the style guide wants us to. So this is really helpful. However, since May, this extension is no longer working. So if you're still using VS Code before May, maybe the company where you work at needs some time to allow you to upgrade, you can still use this extension, which is great. But if you're using a VS Code version that was released after May, then it doesn't work. And VS Code also shows us the variables that are not being used. So this can also help us to clean up a little bit. Okay, next one is the module. Now let's talk a little bit about the project organization. This is important because organization is going to play an important role in performance as well. So bigger modules mean bigger bundles, and bigger bundles take a little bit more time for the user to download to the browser. So we created a brand new project, and now what's the next step? How do we organize our code? Do we import everything in app module? So a good guideline to follow is to split our application into at least 3 different modules: the core, the shared, and the future. Excuse me. So depending on the size of the project, we might need more than one feature module as well. So in the core module, we declare all the services that will have a single instance in the application, what we call the global services. Since Angular version 6, it was introduced the provide-in services. So even using the provide-in services, we can still use the core module. However, we don't need to add the service in the providers anymore. So Angular will take care of that for us. In the share module, we can also call it the common module. We can declare all the presentational components shared between the modules. We can also have utility classes and pipes. So these components, they don't import services and other components from other modules as well. So they are just alone, standalone components. And here, if you are using Angular material, for example, you can also import Angular material here and re-export. Excuse me. Oops. And lastly, we have the feature module. So this is going to be a module with a specific functionality. It can be a screen. It can be a set of screens, so multiple screens. It doesn't matter. It depends how you're going to organize your project. So if you have only one screen, it can be a module of a single screen, or if you have multiple screens, you can also use it. So I like to keep in mind smaller bundles, and depending on how the user is going to use the application, I like to create multiple modules inside a module. So in this example, I have a menu for reports, and then the reports display the link for each report. So each report will have its own module, and we can also do that. This is going to help us to have smaller bundles, and we can use lazy loading as well to load all these modules on demand, which is going to help a lot with performance. And if you need to have that particular module already loaded, so it's ready to use for the user to use, you can do that. You can preload that module. So here we can say preload true, and then we pass an extra option saying use this preloader class. That's gonna see if we need to preload it or not. So this is also really simple, and it's gonna help a lot with performance as well. So after we create our modules, we need to start thinking about components. And for Angular, size matters. So there is a technique, which is dividing the components between containers and components, that is very popular in React. But we can apply the same to Angular as well. And you can also do this when your template starts to grow and it's becoming really big, and you want to reuse some code, or you just want to organize it better. You can do this as well. And this makes easier to write tests because we're going to have smaller components, and all the main logic is going to be on the containers. So separating presentational from container components, it's really easy. We have the presentational components. These components do not inject services, so they are on their own. And they're only going to receive data to be displayed in the template through input properties. And in case we need to emit an event, we're going to use the output properties for that. That's the reason why these components are called dumb components, because they don't know anything about the business logic. They just receive data and they just emit data so other components can act on it. As an example, I have here just a list of tasks. As you can see, we receive everything by input, output. We don't even have a constructor. We don't have services or anything. We just display on the template. So this will be a presentational component. And then we have those containers, which are called the smart components. So the containers helps us to organize the layout, and it can also help us to have the business functionality in a single component instead of having all over the place in the application. These components are going to listen to events that are going to be emitted by the presentational components, and it's also going to pass data to the presentational components. So all of the main logic will be here, excuse me, on the containers. So we're going to listen to the events and we're going to pass data as well. That's all we're going to do. And on the container itself, as you can see, we can have a service, and then this container is going to talk to the service. So this is going to make easier to test as well, because all the more complex tests that we have to do, it's going to be in a single component. And all the other presentational components are easier to test because they're just input and output properties. And the smaller components are also easier to maintain because of this. So next, we have abstraction as well. That can be a great ally in a world where Angular is releasing a new version every 6 months. And we know sometimes we have a little bit of headache upgrading from one version to the other. And we want to make this process as smooth as possible. So one thing that I like to use are wrappers, just to keep consistency. And we had a great experience with this when we had to upgrade from HTTP to HTTP client. To HTTP client. So we created an API service that replaces the HTTP, and here we have all our methods: the get, post, put, delete, download file, upload file, and so on. So when we had to upgrade from HTTP to HTTP client, we only had to upgrade this particular class. And this is the class that is being used as HTTP in our application. So that's why it was ready to use. And here we can also keep consistency, because sometimes developers might have a different standard whenever doing request and response. And here we can also set all these standards. And this is a case of composition, but sometimes it's always is also interesting using inheritance. So one case that I like a lot is using with the form. Angular has a great API for forms, but sometimes you want that extra, you know? You want to submit only if the form is valid. So you don't have to copy and paste the same logic throughout all the forms in your application. You can create your forms. These forms can extend the base component or the super component, and then the form will also have the same behavior. So this is also really helpful. The tip number 8 is alias for module. This helps organizing the project and also helps to keep the code cleaner. So depending on the organization and how many nested modules you have, you might end up something like this or even worse. And according to TS-Lint, we only have 125 characters for the path, and sometimes it's going to be bigger than that. So we can have something like this, which is simple and cleaner. And this is really easy to do. All you have to do is just inside the TS config, you define what's your alias and what's the path. And there you go. You can use it here and have cleaner imports. So once we're done with the application, we're going to do the production build. And going back to tip number 1, Angular CLI. So the CLI is going to help us to optimize, obfuscate, get rid of any unnecessary code. So it has a lot of good functionalities in it. And of course, don't forget to do the continuous integration and make this process automatic, because you can have some headaches when your project goes to production if you are doing the build manually. So there are a lot of great continuous integration tools that you can use with Angular, and most of them have support to NPM scripts as well. Or if you're using, for example, Angular with Java, you can use Maven. If you're using with .NET, you can also use the build for .NET as well. Oops. And the last tip that I have to share with you is the shared libraries. So if you have some code, maybe you create a really nice component you want to reuse in other projects, and you don't want to do a copy and paste, and that makes it really hard to maintain the code later. So creating a shared library might help, and might help a lot, especially if you are reusing through projects. If you're still using Angular 5 or Angular 4, there is this packager, which is the ng packager, that helps us to create a shared library. And you can also publish this library in NPM later. However, if you're using Angular version 6 already, the CLI version 6 also supports to add, excuse me, also supports to add libraries. So you can have multiple projects within the same workspace. To do it, it's really simple. As you create a new component or service, you can also create a library. You can also set a prefix. And then whenever you are generating component services, you can refer to your project. You can build it. And in your source code, in your application, you just refer to the library as any other third-party library. Same thing as you would use Angular Material or Bootstrap or ngPrime. And inside your HTML, you can also use it. So this is a great way to keep your shared components separate from your main component, and maybe in the future you can publish as well. And Angular 6, it's going to automatically add the path for you as well. So this is great. You don't have to do anything. The CLI will do everything for you. Well, that's it. I hope that I could share the 10 tips with you. I don't know if you knew all of these 10 tips, but I hope you can use it in your current project or maybe in your next project. I have here my social networks once again, and I also have some references that I'll share in the slides later that you can use to learn more about a few things that I mentioned here. Thank you. Gracias.
¿Alguien quiere participar con alguna pregunta? ¿Alguien? Okay, so looks like we have some questions.
Okay.
Vénganse por acá. No, por acá mejor.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Not very good.
Can you?
I can hear Luis, but I cannot hear you.
Here, can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Okay. I have a question. Why use static class for defined values for APIs instead of inject values in your provider?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat?
Okay. Use static class for defined constant values. Instead, use inject values directly in your provider.
It depends on the scenario. As I mentioned, for the environments, you can set different environments. So depending if you are developing the application, you want to use a particular value, and when you are going to production, you want to use a different value. So this is going to for the that I see this being with the locale of the application. By default, Angular is English, but if you want to change the locale, for example, to Spanish or Portuguese or any other language, you can do that using the static provider, and you can do it by creating a static value in any of the classes as well. But whenever I can, if those values are not going to be different per environment, I do create a static. It's like I'm also a Java developer. So in Java, we create a lot of interfaces for static values as well, like constants. So you can use that with TypeScript as well. But if those values are going to be different from development to production, for example, then I prefer to use the environments. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. ¿Alguien más quiere participar? Puede ser portugués, puede ser inglés. Por acá, por favor.
Hi. Let's focus on C. I have a question, because in one of your latest tips you mentioned using a library, and I want to know what's the main difference between a library and a shared module.
Okay, so the share module have pipes. Let's say, so work with projects that we have users from Latin America. The date format is one thing that is going to use the same. So it's going to be day, month, and year. So you create a pipe in particular, this date format. You can still use the Angular date pipe, but then you can extend it and then apply your specific date format. So if you're only going to use it once, you can have it in a share module, because you're only going to use it for this particular project. But this pipe or component or service is going to be used by different modules of your Angular application. So in this case, I will put it in the shared module, because it's only the scope is only going to be this application. But if you are reusing this pipe in different projects, so as let's say you are working in a company and you have 5 Angular projects, and you need to use the same Angular pipe to format the date with day, month, and year. You don't want to copy the pipe in one project, then the other, then the other, then the other. So you want to avoid that copy and paste. So what you can do in this case, because you're going to use the same code in multiple projects, you can create a library for that. And then you can do the npm install. I mean, you can declare your library in one project. You can create an npm package from it, and then you can install in the other projects. This way, if you need to change it, you only change it one place and update in the other projects.
Okay, thank you for that. ¿Alguien más quiere participar? Por acá, por favor. So we have one question, another question.
Hi. I wonder if for example, I have a feature module that has another submodules within this module. Is it a good practice to have a shared module in this feature module, or maybe this shared module should be in the general shared module?
Depends on the scope. I like global shared modules, so all modules can use that. But if you have a bigger module with submodules in it, and this module is gonna use some code, you can create a module for your module. So this way, but if another module or another component from another module, it's going to use that particular component, then I will move it to the global shared module. So it depends, it all depends on the scope where you're going to use it. Because at the end of the day, what you want to avoid is those nested imports, you know, dot, slash, dot, dot, dot. So you have like a big import. So this way you can keep it in the scope and it's easier to control it as well.
Thanks.
Okay. Again, thank you a lot for your time, Loiane. I hope we can talk to you again. So, por favor, un gran aplauso para Loiane.
Thank you, gracias.
Muchas gracias, Loiane.
Gracias.